So firstly, welcome everyone to this SEN Fringe event. My name's Sam Hall. I'm the Director of the Conservative Environment Network. For those of you who don't know us, we're the independent forum for Conservatives who support net zero, nature restoration and resource security. The title of this panel discussion is Balancing Act, Can Renewables Get Us to Net Zero? And I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel to discuss that topic. Before introducing them all, I'd like to give a few contextual remarks just to set the scene for this discussion. So we know that because of our energy security and our climate change goals, we need to build lots more clean power. And in recent years, the big growth in clean energy generation has predominantly come from wind and solar. And we've seen over the course of a decade, other than a blip a couple of years ago, big cost reductions in those technologies, which have helped to drive them into ever greater number onto the grid. Under the new Labour government, we're seeing, I think, an arguably even bigger acceleration of that rollout of renewable energy. So what I'm hoping we'll discuss in this panel is how can we manage this increase in intermittent generation on the grid? What else is needed to be there on the grid to balance out wind and solar? How can we make sure that this rollout of renewable energy is bringing down people's bills and making our industrial electricity prices more competitive? How can we deal with some of the local opposition that inevitably comes from rolling out this clean power infrastructure? And what is the role of other types of energy generation as well, such as gas, CCUS and nuclear? So lots to discuss, and I'd like to thank our sponsor, ScottishPower, for making this panel possible. So just to introduce our speakers in order. So starting with Samuel Kurtz on my right. Samuel is the Conservative Senate member for Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire and the Shadow Minister for Economy and Energy in the Welsh Senate. Next, we've got Lord Martin Callanan, who is the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero under the last government, with a particular responsibility for energy efficiency and green finance. Next to my left, we've got Keith Anderson, the Chief Executive of ScottishPower, formerly the CEO of ScottishPower Renewables. Next to my left, we've got Daisy Powell-Chandler, the Head of Energy and Environment Practice at Public First, and also a non-exec director on the board of SEN. And then lastly, on the left, we've got Charles Hendry, who was the Minister of State at the Department for Energy and Climate Change under the coalition government and was a Conservative MP from 1992 to 2015. So delighted to be joined by such an excellent panel. So I'm now going to invite them all to give some short opening remarks. Please try and keep it to around 3 minutes so that people have lots of time to ask questions. And those of you in the audience, please be thinking of what questions you would like to put to our panellists. And also can I encourage you as well to tweet along on social media. Our handle is @sen_HQ. It'd be great to get some engagement on social media as well. But now I'd like to turn to our first speaker on the list, which I think is Martin Callanan. Thank you, Martin.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Sam. Thank you for the invitation to join you. I think this is the first of your meetings for the last 7 years that I've done not as a minister and can now observe what's going on in the department and in policy. But of course, what is fascinating about it, whatever changes Labour announced, the fundamental challenges still remain and they still face the same issues as we faced. So in direct answer to your question that you posed us about can renewables get us to net zero, well, obviously they are an essential component, but of course they're not the only component. It of course depends whether you include nuclear in your definition of renewables or not. That will also be essential, but there are lots of other things that we will need to go along with that. I'm thinking of developments in hydrogen, on CCUS, load shifting, smart meters, etc. All the components of a smart, flexible generation system. And so from this government so far, we've seen two pretty big announcements. The first one, of course, was the creation of Great British Energy. And despite my best efforts, including talking to many of my former civil servants, nobody seems to have any idea of what it's actually going to do. It has been allocated a budget of is it £7.5 billion it managed to wheedle out of the Treasury, despite the so-called 22 billion black hole that they claim that they have discovered. But what this money is going to be spent on, how it's going to be spent, and how that will work in a system which at the moment is essentially private. Government sets the conditions, it sets the CFDs, etc., but all of the development is done by private companies. And how a project developed by Great British Energy is going to sit alongside all of the existing private schemes, I don't know. How is the Secretary of State, for example, going to decide on DCOs, in which he obviously has a vested interest because he owns, on behalf of the taxpayer, part of the energy system linked to it? How is he going to decide in a competitive CFD auction between a project developed by Keith and ScottishPower and one developed by Great British Energy? It seems to me that there's a massive conflict of interest there, and any court would adjudicate that the Secretary of State is not competent to take that decision because you have a vested interest in it. So there's lots of questions still to answer. The legislation that they brought forward provides no answers to that whatsoever. Those who've seen the bill, it's just a framework bill. It just gives lots of secondary legislation powers to the Secretary of State. So we'll have to wait and see how that will pan out. Their other big announcement is their proposal to try and decarbonise the electricity system to 2030, which I think, frankly, is a laudable aim. I think it's impossible to achieve in practice, but it's a laudable aim. And I'm sure that many of the civil servants will have been advising the current Secretary of State, the same as they advised us as ministers, that 2035 was a pretty challenging target. So to bring it forward to 2030 is even more difficult, because even if you can overcome all of the obstacles, and the main obstacle in developing renewables is, of course, the current planning system. Everything that we did was judicially reviewed and taken through all of the different stages. And it's the big barrier to any infrastructure in this country. And all of the announcements from Angela Rayner and DLUC and other energy announcements all come up against the fundamental barrier of just how hard it is to do anything in the UK. And we had a lot of projects ongoing to try and unblock many of those barriers, but I don't see anything from Labour that's going to make it any faster. They've also, of course, delayed some of the announcements of projects that we had ongoing. So an essential component to counteract the intermittency of renewables generation is, of course, CCUS. We had a very active CCUS programme. The final investment decisions were due to be taken in September. Was the deadline that we had set to take the final decisions. And even then, even if you take the FID decisions now, and they've been delayed, I'm told, until Rachel Reeves looks at them in the budget, you're still going to be struggling to get much CCUS online by 2030, 2031. And that's even with the substantial amounts of support that we'd already secured from the Treasury. So quite how delaying that, how does that allow you then to get all of your renewable generation on stream and ready, and with backup and with all of the other components that I talked about by 2030? So I think there are some huge challenges remaining for this government. The other additional one, of course, is the one of domestic heat decarbonisation. So how do you 80% of heat in the UK at the moment is generated by gas, and how you electrify that is one of the biggest policy challenges that any government will face. Frankly, we delayed some of the key decisions that everybody knew are necessary for that. It reminds me of I spent many years in the European Parliament, and Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission President, when he was dealing with the financial crisis, he said a lot of things, but one particular phrase sticks in my mind. He said, "We all know what we had to do, we just don't know how to get elected when we've done it." And in some respects, on a kind of lesser scale, the domestic heat decarbonisation system is like that. Everybody knows there's lots of policy advice in the department. All officials know exactly what needs to be done. You need to rebalance prices. You need to announce phase-out dates for gas boilers, etc. Everybody knows what needs to be done, but how you overcome the domestic political objections to that, and of course the vested interests that will try to stop you doing it, is the great policy challenge that will remain. We delayed some of the key decisions, particularly under the last Secretary of State, And Labour have got no choice. They're going to have to go ahead with any of these things because they're faced with a whole series of carbon budgets as a consequence of the net zero legislation. And I will be an interested observer over the next few months to see how they get on with some of these policy challenges. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Martin. That was a really helpful overview of some of the new Labour government's early moves on energy. Now, come to you, Samuel.
Thank you very much, Sam, and good morning, Body Day, everybody. Thank you for... Oh, you beg your pardon. Thank you. And thank you to CEN for the invite. So I represent the beautiful constituency of Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire and have a vested interest in that. I represent the UK's largest energy port, the Port of Milford Haven, 2 LNG terminals, a RWE power station, the most efficient gas power station in Western Europe, and Valero oil refinery. So we're a county and a community deep-rooted in energy and petrochemical and hydrocarbons. So the context in Wales is one where obviously we've had a Labour government since the advent of devolution in 1997, and onshore wind has been one of the most difficult hurdles for communities to get involved with. And Sam, in his opening remarks, mentioned that the discussion around community involvement in projects and how we can get permission from communities around infrastructure and the construction of infrastructure in their areas. And some of you may know the beautiful Towie Valley in Carmarthenshire, where there's an energy company looking to put pylons through what is an area of outstanding natural beauty, going through the heart of mid-Wales to export energy out of Wales in an effect. And that's where community engagement, community buy-in, community benefit from projects excites me at the opportunities of how can we empower communities around renewable energy, make them feel as if they have a stake in this and not seeing the export of electrons out of their community and their bills not being affected accordingly. Because we have a real opportunity as net exporters in Pembrokeshire. We've got the Celtic Sea, and it's great to see Selene Saxby here, who was the former chair of the Celtic Sea APPG in Parliament. And the opportunities around the Celtic Sea are phenomenal, especially in floating offshore wind. We're out in Dublin with our committee, the Economy, Trade and Rural Affairs Committee, a couple of weekends ago, and being able to talk to them about their vision of exporting through the interconnectors, the Greenlink interconnector, which comes into Pembrokeshire in my constituency from just outside of Rosslare, and the ability to share energy through energy security is another opportunity which I think sometimes is undervalued in trying to mitigate the effects of global markets, especially gas global markets. So there's a real opportunity that Wales can be at the forefront of being a producer and an export market, but also one where the community needs to have involvement in how that looks. And unfortunately in Wales we've got NRW, the amalgamation of environment agencies and planning agencies, who are at the moment having a budget cut and seeing over 200 jobs being slashed from their books. And those are jobs that will be delivering on planning applications and making these decisions. So there seems to be a stagnation of what the Welsh Labour government are doing in terms of policy, and then their masters in London saying another thing completely, and they're at odds with each other, which is quite refreshing as someone who's grown up in Wales under 14 years of Conservative government and a Welsh Labour government pointing up the M4 saying it's those buggers' problem and their fault up there. It's quite refreshing that they've nowhere to hide at the moment, and there's a reality that there is no shadows for them to hide in trying to appeal to the electorate, as Lord Martin said, but also trying to deliver on their policy objectives around net zero. So there's a huge opportunity there. And one of the failures that we've seen within Welsh Government as well is retrofitting of homes and the going after the low-hanging fruit rather than really delivering on the opportunities around retrofitting. And the cuts to the winter fuel payment really do hit Wales because we have an older population, we have far more rural communities, and in those communities we have more traditional housing, which does need further investment in insulation, etc. So there's a bit of an oxymoron happening at the moment of what's being said at one side of the M4 in London and what's actually being delivered by a Labour government in Cardiff. So very, very interested to be here for this discussion and how we as Conservatives have some of those answers to the difficult questions. Thank you, Sam.
Great, thank you very much, Samuel. Over to Charles next.
Sam, thank you very much indeed, and delighted to be here. I want to start by talking about ambition, and that when we came into government in 2010, and I was fortunate to be the minister at that point, everybody said to us, you can't achieve the goals which your government have got. At that point, renewables were 6% of our electricity generation, and we had inherited a target from the Labour government of getting it to 30% by 2020. Almost everybody, probably apart from Keith, said you're never going to get there. We adopted policies. We had a roadmap in place. We didn't just get to 2030, to 30% by 2020, but we're now at 50%. This is the greatest decarbonisation success story in the world. And as a Conservative Party, we need to own it. And we need to be a party of high ambition, and we need to be a party which says, look, if we are going to come back into government, then this is an area where we really have to make progress, and we have to be seen to be champion those causes. Because if you aim low, you will succeed low. And what we know as well is that 70% of the population want us to succeed in getting to net zero. So if we put ourselves on the wrong side of that debate, we automatically alienate people who we need to be voting for us. So we need to be planning now for how we make sure that we are not an obstruction to what Labour's ambitions are, but we hold them to account, because it will be hugely challenging and there will be problems along the way. But then let's build on our own record and say, look, we're not going to cede this ground to Labour. We're actually going to be the champions for what we've been able to do. They made some great appointments, bringing in Chris Stark as the head of mission control, the former head of the Committee on Climate Change, bringing in Jürgen Meyer, the former head of Siemens in the UK, for GB Energy. We may not know what GB Energy is going to do, but they would have struggled to find somebody who has a better understanding of both the energy and the industry side of this equation. And then you've got ministers in Ed Miliband for many issues which we would disagree with him, but he knows this brief. He cares passionately about this brief, and he will be back there on the global stage, giving the UK a voice, which I think has been sadly a bit missing over the last few years. So there are areas where we should try to take the politics out of energy, and we should try to get the better outcome as far as this country is concerned. The mix is going to be critical. So if we're going to get to net zero, it's going to be not one single solution, but a whole range of multiple solutions. We can see an enormous queue of new battery connections being proposed, far more than we can ever need. And often those batteries will be useful for taking solar power from the day and using it to be used in the evening. Our resilience issues come more in terms of the seasonal differences. So that the huge solar bursts in the summer, how do we replace that in the winter? How do we deal with those very, very cold days when the wind isn't blowing? And how do we make sure that we keep the lights on at those times? And I think that does mean keeping some gas in the mix, and the Prime Minister has been realistic about that. But it also means, therefore, we've got to take forward carbon capture if we're going to be able to do that in a way that guarantees the security and does it in a way that is going to be low carbon as well. We'll see much more progress in terms of flexing demand. Some of you probably already see those moments on days when there's particularly high demand and you're offered a very small amount of savings if you reduce your demand. Over 1 million people, 1 million households are now opting into those schemes, and that will become ever more commonplace as we go forward. And that means that there'll be parts of the energy infrastructure that we may not need to build. That's now already the equivalent of a coal-fired power station, with being able to be taking that out of demand and being able to ensure that we can keep the lights on and do so in a way that is broadly affordable. Challenges, of course, but broadly affordable. Additional interconnection is going to be part of that. We're seeing a lot of investment going into building the new bootstraps, as they're called, between Scotland and England to get power from Scotland into the English economy. But we need to be looking at how we do that more internationally as well. Discussions now about bringing power in from Morocco, looking at can you build a link across the Atlantic so you get the advantage of the time differences as well. And the technology is there. These are very expensive and ambitious projects. But I want the UK to be a global leader when it comes to seeing those opportunities in different technologies and being how we can then take it forward. But as Conservatives as well, we've got to make sure that we do this in a way that carries people with us. And I think that means going rather further than Labour is, and what they're talking about, planning changes. Planning is one of the biggest issues here. But there is, I think, a space for us in this debate, which is that it's very easy for people to be against some development locally. Most people are neutral. There's a passionate number who are pro. But if we want to move people from neutral to being pro, it's got to be much clearer what they get as the benefit. And that means new approaches towards community ownership, perhaps, in those areas. It means ensuring that people really get a benefit from being close to that infrastructure. And then you mobilise people from saying, I don't really want that here because it's visually intrusive. You move those people to saying, if that's going to help my bills, if that's going to give me real impact, then actually I do want it here. Because it's more important to me to have affordability than to have some wind turbines nearby. And there I think we can engage with people and bring them into this debate and in this discussion in a way that will help us to do so. And the final point I'd make is one of consistency. I was the Energy Minister for the first 2.5 years of those 14. Andrew Bowie was the one at the end. Between me and him were 20 Energy Ministers. And that's when you look at Secretaries of State, those in the Lords, in totality, over 20 ministers. We need consistency. I'm not saying that I should have done it for all 14 years, but that we need to have an approach where people get into this brief, they really get into the depths and understanding in the way that Martin did, and that we make sure that people see this as just one of the most exciting areas of policy to be involved in, but also incredibly important for the future well-being of our country. So a plea for some consistency, but to be constructive in the way that we engage with the government and that we make sure that we do so in a way that carries people with us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charles. Daisy.
So, slight confession. Charles has so completely stolen all of my lines. That first of all, I'm really enthusiastic about the idea of 14 years of you. But also it gives me more time to dwell upon something which I'm sure someone will raise in questions, which is what happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Which Charles has touched upon, but I think we can draw out a little bit more because I know it is something that causes concern to people. So first of all, to come back to the main essay question, can renewables get us to net zero? As Martin said, no, they're not going to get us all the way to net zero, but they are an incredibly key piece of this picture. Because if we want to keep growing, if we want to become more productive, one of the things we are going to do as a country is we're going to electrify hugely. And whether we do that using green energy or whether we do that by burning stuff, we're going to need more of it. And that means more pylons. So one of the things we probably need to get away from in the infrastructure question is saying that we need these pylons because we're going green. We need these pylons because we're growing and we're getting better at doing stuff. And those are all really exciting. This isn't a bad thing. This isn't a hair shirt project. This is about Britain growing into the future. So we need plentiful, clean energy. And how are we going to do that? Well, it turns out that the biggest problem isn't the intermittency. As Lord Callanan said, the biggest problem is planning. Opponents worry a lot about intermittency, though, so it is worth us unpicking that. It seems a little contrary, though, because, for example, just because we don't see something happening doesn't mean it didn't happen. I didn't see Keith eat breakfast, but I assume that if he needed breakfast in order to make this panel happen, then he probably ate it. Likewise, some people come out of NHS hospitals with bandages. I assume someone makes sure that the bandages get to the hospitals. And yet, we have this continuing argument about intermittency, despite the fact that right now, 60% of our grid is running on intermittent net zero sources. 60%. This isn't something that we're going to switch to doing in 2030. It's something we've actually been doing for decades. Even before we started to move to renewables, gas power stations were getting smaller, more decentralised. We were putting them in different parts of the country. And so it was already becoming more complicated to manage our grid. Now, the great news is we're really good at this. The UK is a leader in AI and in machine learning and in the kind of tech that you need to manage a decentralised grid. And I look forward to a world where we're out there selling it to everybody else. So this is a great trading opportunity for us as well. We also, as Sam mentioned, need to get much more serious about the Celtic Sea. The thing that I think most people probably don't know, because it's a really weird thing to know, is that the wind in the Celtic Sea is not correlated with the wind in the North Sea, which sounds like really weird knowledge to hold in my brain, but is important because it means that there is less time when the wind isn't blowing. And in fact, the increasing turbulence of our weather due to climate change is causing there to be more wind at more times. So in fact, the risk of there being a dunkelflaute, despite that being a great word that we all want to say more often, is lessening over time. But what about the public? Charles mentioned public approval for all of this, and we spend a lot of time saying, how are we going to bring the public with us? Well, the first thing to mention is, again, there's a whole load of transitions that happen in public life that we don't ask the public's permission for. We regularly restructure things, change how we do things, and we don't worry about how the public responds to it because it's going to happen anyway. And this is that. Energy transitions happen not because we have chosen them for the most part, but because they are a fact of life. The Industrial Revolution happened. Conservatives fronted the dash to gas. These were all for reasons that were due to geopolitics and economics and running out of resources. They weren't because, it suddenly seemed like a good idea. We're going to get the public involved by making it cheap and easy and aspirational. This is about the public as consumer. This is about making people want EVs, which they should because they're really lovely to drive. And if we rebalance energy bills, they'll also be much cheaper to drive, although they're already a little cheaper to drive. But a lot of the other ways in which the public are going to be involved are in helping to manage that intermittency. Because when you move to electric heating or driving an electric car, quite often the times at which you charge those, even for an industrial process, you can have a heat battery. So the time at which you use that electricity can be much more flexible, which means you can charge up your car, home, factory when energy is cheap. You could even put your factory somewhere right next to some nice turbines where the energy could be a lot cheaper. And that can also save you on your bills, as well as reducing the risks of intermittency to the country. So I would make a plea that yes, renewables are a large part of the solution to get to net zero. We have a lot of the tech that we need to get us there. We need to take the public with us by making it cool and nice and cheap. And we know how to do that because there's a lot of nice capitalists in this room. And we need to do it in a conservative way by making sure that the market sends out appropriate signals that make it cheaper, easier and nicer.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Daisy. And lastly, Keith.
Thank you, Sam. Good thing about being last is everybody said everything already. Look, couple of things. A simple answer to your question is yes, you can get to net zero with renewables. Absolutely. If you go back 16 years, and why am I going back 16? 16 years ago, Ed Miliband was Secretary of State for Energy. And 16 years later, he's back in the same job. So what's changed? A huge amount. And it's worthwhile remembering just how much we have changed. 16 years ago, we had 30 gigawatts of coal generating electricity on the system. Next week, the last coal plant in the UK shuts down. That's a massive change. A colossal change.
It's today.
Is it today? There you go. Fantastic. Okay. It's a colossal change. We've got 30 gigawatts of renewables on the system today. 15 of that's offshore. We've shifted massively. So why are we bothering with the debate? What's worrying us? The issue now is really about pace and how do we go further and how do we go faster and how do we achieve that? And that's when you get to the importance of clean power 2030. The previous government had clean power 2035. This government have gone for clean power 2030. And from my perspective, whether it's 2030 or 2032, I'm not really too bothered and too worried. Okay. The important thing is to have our target. But the really, really important thing, in fact, the vital thing, and something we've been missing for quite some time, is to have a plan on how you hit that target. And that's really what's been missing over the last number of years. And I think that's the one thing that with the appointment of Chris Stark and working with Jürgen at Great British Energy, we will get a plan. Okay? And right now the trajectory is that by the end of October, the first part of that plan will be there. The new system operator will have mapped out what grid lines do you need and what mix of generation do you have on the system to hit Clean Power 2030 that provides the stability that we need and classifies as being clean power. And the terminology clean power is important because it allows you to have at least a 5% gas strategic reserve on the system. Okay? And is that a cop-out? No. And it's worthwhile remembering the expression net zero. It's not zero, it's net zero. And clean power doesn't mean zero, it means it's clean. Okay? Why is clean power important? Clean power is important and the date's important because if you can't get to clean power, you can never ever ever get to net zero. It's impossible. The other really important thing about clean power is the behaviours it can drive as well. Because if you think about it, when we turn around and tell you it's clean power, everything you plug in your house is clean. That's a fantastic step forward. Whether that's you plugging your car in, your mobile phone, your TV, it's all using clean power. And that helps the transition with heat, because it helps the conversation about why do we want you to move from gas to electricity? Because it's clean. And it's a nice, simple, straightforward message to start getting out to people. It's great from an industrial point of view. Why do we want to shift the industrial processes from thermal power to electricity? Because it's clean. All the electricity we use is clean. And it's a huge, huge step forward. Right, so what else does all of this do? And why all of the investment that we need? It's about economic growth as well. If this country wants to grow in any way, shape or form, we need the most monumental investment in our electricity system, both in the grid and in the sources of generation. Between now and somewhere between 2035 and 2040, we will double the amount of electricity we need in this country if we want economic growth. If you want houses built, if you want data centres, if you want to be a leader in AI technology, if you want to have a hydrogen economy, if you want to grow this economy in any way, shape or form, we need more electricity. And that's what this is all about. It's not just about renewables, it's about the growth of the entire country, about creating jobs, about growing the economy. From our point of view as a company, it's taken us 25 years to build the renewables portfolio we have today. We're a 100% renewable generator. We are going to double that in the next 5 years. And that's the kind of increase in pace we need to see right across the whole of the UK. It's taking us too long to do it, so it needs to get faster and faster. When we get the original plan out of the system operator at the end of October, that will be turned into the final clean power plan by the end of December this year. Okay? And when you look at that plan and ask, can it be done? Physically, yes. From an engineering perspective, yes. From the perspective of keeping the lights on, yes. With the current policies and frameworks, no. But the important thing is what that plan will then drive is the conversation about what needs to change. And as a country, are we willing to make those changes? Are we willing to push through the changes in the planning system? Are we willing to push through the changes to give us economic growth? Are we willing to push through the changes to give us clean power? Because that's when the hard choices will really, really happen and the big decisions will get made. But at least we'll have a plan. What that plan will also drive is what we need to do in hydrogen and what we need to do in carbon capture. And we will have a real strategy and idea and understanding of how big a hydrogen economy we want and what we want to use the hydrogen for. We'll have a real understanding of how many carbon capture gas generation plants do we need and want, because what do we need to balance the system? And that's why this work becomes so critical, because it lays that out step by step. I think that will also massively feed into the debate about what does Great British Energy do and what's its role in helping all of that happen. And I think predominantly a huge part of its role will be about how do you create a framework and a market mechanism for carbon capture? How do you create the framework in the market for hydrogen? How do you get those new technologies up and running, and maybe even some of the infrastructure for floating offshore wind to help deliver that clean power aim? So we can do it, we can deliver it, it's absolutely possible, but we will need to make hard choices as a country.
Great, thank you very much, Keith. Before coming to questions, I had a couple of my own, which I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege to ask. So the first one, just picking up on the point about planning reform, because it came up an awful lot, and I think pretty much in every speech, as something that we really need to crack if we're going to deliver renewables at the pace we need to, and also at a lower cost, and reduce some of the risk and uncertainty for developers. But we also heard on the panel about the importance of community engagement and taking time to ask communities what they think about renewable energy generation. So my question is, are these two things in conflict, and how do we get the right balance between doing that good community engagement so you don't get as much opposition, but also making sure that the planning system is much faster in getting the decision that we need for whether renewable development can go ahead? I don't know whether maybe Sam, if I can ask you to comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. And Daisy touched on it as well, is the community benefit communities can feel in lower bills is a real tangible benefit. So if we're looking at projects in specific communities where there is that tangible benefit in lower bills, then that is a real benefit, and that will help in the consultation process. And the Welsh Government have brought through an infrastructure bill to try and streamline the development of some of the key infrastructure elements around renewables. And while it looks good, in practice we shall see that we haven't had one of the projects go through that system as of yet. But on the community benefit side of it as well, too often community benefit has been seen as a token gesture, so a sponsorship of a local football team shirts, for example. But let's look more holistically and strategically at community benefit. I mentioned in my opening remarks around the retrofitting of homes. Well, let's use community benefit in a way of targeting retrofitting into these areas, using benefits that could potentially be raised by these community projects or these projects in these communities. Let's see there's a benefit there, not just in directly lowering their bills, but lowering their bills in other ways, more strategically looking across holistically at that. And I think that's where the opportunity comes in. If these communities feel like they're not being exploited and the resources that they see around them are being exploited, then they're far more engaging, because a lot of community ownership turbines exist in Wales where there are pots of money the community does benefit from, but we need to look more strategically across a larger area, especially when it comes to the floating offshore wind opportunities in the Celtic Sea. That's 40 clicks off the coast. You're not going to see these projects, but you're going to see the infrastructure coming onshore. And so how can those communities be involved in the benefit of having the infrastructure and the tunnelling, for example, coming through their area? Well, lower bills is a really easy place to start with, but let's look more holistically, especially as we've got 22 local authorities in Wales. Each of them are struggling. So is there a way that these community benefits can strategically address some of the larger constraints that local authorities are having and other areas are having as well?
Great. Martin, you want to come in as well?
Yeah, so, this is not a new problem. We've, for the last year in government, I sat on an interdepartmental panel of ourselves in DESNES, DLUC, Treasury, Number 10, attempting to remove some of the planning roadblocks. And I came to the conclusion a while ago that whilst community benefit is, of course, important, we also need to do something, and it's a much bigger question, about judicial review. It's about the willingness, the increasing willingness of the courts in the UK to insert themselves into what is essentially a political process. I mean, at the end of the day, somebody has to decide whether it's a local authority, whether it's a Secretary of State. It should be, in my view, in the political process for elected, or in my case, not elected, politicians to decide whether a particular project should go ahead or not. So I oversaw the DCO process within DESNES, and in fact, I think it's still going on. When I left office, the decision on whether or not to build a nuclear power station in Sizewell was at the Supreme Court. It had gone through every level of the court process, through numerous levels of appeal and appeal against decisions to grant renew, all sorts of different processes. And the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, the main constitutional body of the UK, was inserting itself into the process of whether or not we build a nuclear power station in Sizewell. Now, I'm sure it will get the go-ahead, but nevertheless, the principle of the courts willing to interfere in planning decisions was getting greater and greater and greater in every year. And so until some government has the courage to tackle that, you won't just have the problem in energy infrastructure, whether it be turbines, pylons or whatever, but you will get it increasingly in other aspects of housing development, etc. Because anybody with a pot of money and a well-motivated lawyer can delay you for years through the court process. And my other favourite statistic in this is the new proposed tideway tunnel under the Thames. So far, we've spent, I think it's £270 million just on planning approvals alone before one spade has been put into the ground in any kind of construction at all, just on planning or environmental impact assessments and all the various minutiae of the system. It is madness. And until we can do something about those fundamental blockages, we're not going to get to net zero to decarbonise the power system by 2030. We certainly aren't going to meet our housing targets. And it'll take the government a while to work this out, but I'm sure at some stage they will come to the conclusion that we have to do something about that.
Great. And my final question I was going to put to the panel, I was going to reach back to one of the panels that we did yesterday at SEN, which was a net zero debate, and we had on the more sceptical side David Frost on the panel, and he was making a lot of points about about the kind of cost and the economics of renewable energy. So in the spirit of coming forward with some practical ideas to tackle that concern, what would you like to see government do that could help make the economics of renewable better, dealing with some of the curtailment issues? We've obviously talked about planning, we've talked about grid in passing as well, but practically what would you like to see that could help address some of those concerns about cost that people do have with renewables? Who wants to go first on that?
Go
Keith,
first.
yeah.
The simplest thing to do is build more of it and stop burning gas. You know, if you look at the problems this country has had with energy prices over the last 3 years, it is all caused by gas. It's volatile gas markets, volatile countries, and we rely on them, and they set the worldwide gas price, and that sets the electricity price in this country. And until we stop burning it and stop running a wholesale system based off a gas price, that's what keeps going. If you get rid of that, the price comes down automatically. Renewables is cheaper. Investing in a new wind farm is the cheapest form of new generation in this country. So that's the cheapest, fastest way of doing it. And that's the trajectory we need to get on, and we need to get there very quickly. That is also the great thing about hitting clean power. If you hit it by 2030, you will be there, because if you look at the generation mix you'll have, even if you still have a 5% strategic gas reserve, that can no longer set the wholesale power price. All the other generation is contracted or fixed price in one way, shape or form, so you can work out the price very, very easily. It's the fastest, best, most sensible way of getting there.
Great. Daisy?
Given that we all agree on so much, I'm going to throw in some slightly more controversial ones, because this is Conservative Party conference after all. We could be more market-led. If we want to reduce costs, we could put that down to consumers, both business consumers and domestic consumers. We could make energy variable depending on whether you have new energy developments happening near you. We could ditch status community benefits where we tell people how much they're going to invest in a community, and we could just say energy's cheaper if you agree to have turbines on the hill next door to you. We could rebalance energy prices so that they actually reflect the carbon cost of the fuel we're burning, so that it's cheaper to use a heat pump or an EV than it is now. These are all market-based, highly conservative. They're about pricing externalities that affect us all. They are exceedingly conservative friendly, and they are very much in the vein of some of the really powerful statements that the coalition made about introducing a carbon price floor, which are why we now have no coal on our system.
Great. And Charles, do you want to come in on this one as well?
So just to add to that, so I think that the first aspect is that one of the big changes we made in government was the electricity market reform, and that brought in the contracts for difference. That was good for investors, but also what it essentially did was it said to people, we will guarantee you a price over a number of years. So if the wholesale price goes up, then it changes. If the wholesale price goes down, it changes. So during these times of very, very high gas prices, those offshore wind farms have been paying money back to the Treasury rather than getting money out of it. So that during the crisis, they were an important part of the solution rather than being part of the problem. The other thing which is going to change is the role of the consumer. And in many ways, the consumer has historically been somebody who has very little choice, apart from being able to choose between the companies. But now, increasingly, they'll be able to decide when they generate, when they store, when they sell to the grid, when they use. And that's going to create a very different dynamic within the market. And then people will be able to say, what is the best balance for my household? When do I charge up my EV? When do I use that power to sell back to the grid? And it will provide a degree of flexibility that will help to drive the cost down. So Lord Frost is simply on the wrong side of the debate on this.
Great. Let's take a few questions. So have we got a roving mic at the back? Yeah, maybe let's start at the back with that gentleman with his hand up there with the glasses on his head. Thank you. There we go.
Do you want me to stand up?
I think you might block the camera if you do that. Right. But yeah, if you could just say your name, where you're from, and then a short question.
Yes, my name is Tom Marshall. I'm Councillor Tom Marshall from Lichfield in Staffordshire. In fact, not very far from here, really. I've heard a lot of the points that have been made, obviously. I'm a little bit disappointed that we haven't had any heretical stance enunciated this morning at all. All we've heard is effectively all the pros of green energy. I've been a Conservative all my life, but I'm simply not on board with net zero. I really, really think it's going to impoverish this country. I think it's going to be quite ruinous. And when you have China and India still burning coal and increasing their coal burning capacity, then we seem to be totally out of step. I'm just wondering, how do you convince the British public to have an air source heat pump and an EV when the majority of people simply don't want them? Recent figures suggest that 13% of the new cars sold this year are EVs. And generally speaking, I read the Telegraph an awful lot. The consensus within the Telegraph readership is that net zero is a scam, and we do not need to subscribe to it. So I'm very sorry that all we've heard this morning is basically propaganda for net zero, and I'm simply not with your debate. And also, I think Lord Frost, I wasn't here to hear that, but I think he's got it right. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That's why I asked the question, and that's why it's great to have these audience questions as well to make sure we are challenging our views and representing all points. So thank you for your points. Please try and keep questions short if we can. Yes, the gentleman here in the third row. Yes.
Hi, Richard Rout from Suffolk, a former parliamentary candidate, sadly lost to the Greens this year. First, a bit of a plea. I think we tend to conflate three different things: clean power, decarbonisation, and net zero. And I think for those in the room, we understand the difference between each of those. But for those outside the room, I think it complicates matters unnecessarily. My first question is around solar, and we've focused a lot today on cheap. Everybody keeps saying cheaper bills, etc., etc. My question is at what cost? And the solar industry has moved at glacial pace in terms of its supply chain guarantees. I'm talking specifically about links to the forced labour camps in China, 80% of the world's polysilicon coming from that region. How do we make the solar industry move at pace and ensure that our decarbonisation isn't done on the back of slave labour in China? There was an announcement last month, but again, very, very slow moving. I think they know what's under that rock and they don't want to pick it up. The second question is around how do we carry the public with us, and is that compatible with 2030? I think the gentleman that spoke before me, you hear the reticence, the anger that's out there. Can we deliver those regulatory and planning changes, like compensation for homeowners, in that time frame to 2030, realistically? I fear that 2030 will turn people against decarbonisation.
Yeah. Lady at the front.
Thanks. I'm Hannah Staunton from the Thames Estuary Growth Board. I was really interested to listen to Martin talk about Lower Thames Crossing, which is the project which is hopefully going to move forward, or at least move fairly soon. One of the things that we were quite instrumental in is getting a pledge out of the Lower Thames Crossing to build using hydrogen, which was very interesting because it will probably help move forward the planning faster, because they're now committing to build with clean energy, but it also means that there is now a market in the estuary, a ready-built market for hydrogen power, which is very interesting. One of the issues that we had from hydrogen producers, that they were saying they would love to come to the estuary, they would love to come to the UK, but they couldn't see an immediate market for that specific technology. So I wonder, in the context of the point that you were making, Martin, around planning, and those kind of areas, where are the areas, where are the levers that we can pull to speed up specifically the planning regime? Because for what it's worth, I would agree that that's a major issue in this space.
Great. So just to recap, we've got a question about how green energy is actually more expensive and we're impoverishing ourselves by going for net zero. A couple of questions, one about how we clean up the solar supply chain and whether the 2030 clean power target might actually be counterproductive in terms of generating local opposition, and a question about hydrogen power and how we can use the planning system to accelerate that as well. Who wants to go first? Maybe if I bring you in, Keith, on
Right. Well, I'll try and rattle through them all very, very quickly. Okay, so on the panel being too pro-green. Okay, look, renewables is going to make it cheaper. It's already making it cheaper. And if you look at stuff like EVs, the price of an EV is rapidly falling and will rapidly fall to the same price as a petrol or a diesel car, and it will start to go below it, and that will be driven by technology and demand and the supply chain. And the same with heat pumps as well. We'll get the cost of the technology down, and we've shown we've been able to get that technology cost down in all sorts of other areas. Best example would be offshore wind. Used to be £150 a megawatt, it's down to about £40 a megawatt. We drive that cost down through technology, through innovation, through investment, through growth, and we'll carry on doing that. And the simplest way to convince people to be part of the change, if people not everybody's always going to buy into the climate change aspect of it or the net zero aspect of it, is to make the choice blindingly obvious. So the EV car will be cheaper than the petrol car, so why the hell wouldn't you buy one? The EV car is cheaper to run than the petrol car, so why the hell wouldn't you buy one? The heat pump will be cheaper than the gas boiler, so why wouldn't you want to buy one? So the industry, through that innovation, through that investment, drives that and helps to create that argument that we create the obvious choice and we make it easier and easier for people to become part of the journey. On the issues around solar, yeah, there are some massive challenges in and around supply chain of solar. And this is always one of the things also for governments and regulators to think about, and markets all around the world, is where you set the priorities in terms of things like the price of a contract for difference. If you just want cheap, and you want it to be cheaper and cheaper all the time, you'll drive companies to looking at supply chains in weird and wonderful places, and you make it more difficult to see investment in your own country in providing some of those goods. So one of the things we're working on with the government just now, with the last government and this government, was how do we build in that supply chain commitment for this country. We've seen a success already in getting Sumitomo to agree to build a cable factory up in the north of Scotland. We're looking to get other cable factories. We need to see more of that, get that investment in the supply chain in this country. It helps to manage the cost, but it also helps to create more inward investment, more jobs and more economic growth. And on hydrogen, it's a fantastic point. I think that one of the big things we miss in this country right now is, what do we want to use the hydrogen for? Okay, I mean, one of the challenges around hydrogen is it uses monumental amounts of electricity. So how much of the electricity do you want to dedicate towards hydrogen production? And then what strategy do you want? What do you want to use that hydrogen for? Do we want to use it for transport and difficult transport? Do we want to use it for industrial processes? Or do you want to use it to turn it into other products to feed industries like the fertiliser sector? And we need to understand what we want to do and where we want to drive it. And out of that, you'll start to create a market. And then you start to create, do you create a demand pool? Do you create a push? What kind of mechanism do you use to start getting that shifted? What's going to convince an industrial company to convert to hydrogen and shift away from thermal power? If they don't know if they can get the hydrogen, if they don't know when the hydrogen is going to be produced, you wouldn't do it. So we need to do that and lay that plan out step by step, but we need to understand where do we want to end up.
Martin, are you name-checked in the hydrogen one? I don't know if you want to come
Sure.
back on that.
Also want to come back on the first gentleman from Lichfield, and frankly, good questions. I confess David Frost is a good friend of mine. We have lots of discussions. We don't agree on this, but we've exchanged lots of comments and questions in the Lords on this. And in fact, I was talking to him only the other day on the same issues. I think what I would put back to you, sir, is what's the alternative? If we're not going to go through the transition, if we're not going to use renewables, where are we going to get our power from? The prosperity of the UK was built on the original industrial revolution, driven by cheap energy, which was cheap coal. If we're not going to use coal and gas now, and remember our gas supplies are running out in the North Sea, I actually think Ed Miliband made a mistake in not extending the life of the North Sea fields. I think we should exploit them as much as we possibly can, because the alternative is to import LNG. But even if we continue to exploit them, as we were planning to do, production in the North Sea is still declining at the rate of, I think it was about 8% per year, just because the fields are naturally running out. So for me, it's fundamentally a question about energy security. Where are we going to get the country's power supplies from in the future? If we continue to use gas power, we're going to be continually subject to energy price shocks. Look at what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. It wouldn't take much to close the Suez Canal, the Straits of Hormuz, etc., if another war breaks out. And you'll see another massive spike in energy prices. The spike that we saw 2 summers ago in energy was driven primarily by gas prices going through the roof because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The reason that I support the rollout of more and more renewables is because it's homegrown energy. It has a UK flag on it. It's not reliant on the Saudis or the Qataris or the Americans or somebody else to deliver our power for us. You know, we have no fundamental choice if we want to make sure we have cheap, renewable energy going forward into the future. If I agree that the politics of it is going to be difficult, and it's very tempting. It's going to be very tempting for the leadership of our party to take a contrary position to many of the government's policies that they're going to have to be going for, because they're going to be very controversial and they're going to be very difficult politically. But for long-term energy security, in my view, we have no choice, and therefore should go for it. With regard to solar, I think you make a good point about the issues of the supply chain. But again, you know, of course, we could have alternative supplies, but it would be more expensive. The thing about solar is by far the cheapest form of energy at the moment. It's getting cheaper every year, primarily driven by cheap solar panels from China, not all of which are produced from Xinjiang. We had a lot of people looking at this in government to try and work out exactly where some of the supplies came from, and there were some issues, no question about that. But again, I think we'd be making a mistake not to go down that route. With regard to hydrogen, I think Keith answered the question. You know, it's primarily again driven by the price of electricity in the UK, which is artificially expensive, and that will help to constrain or not hydrogen production. We did let a load of hydrogen contracts last year. There's again a load projected to be let this year. We'll see where the current government gets to with those.
Great. I'm going to take another round of questions. The one at the back, Finn, on the left.
Thank you. Selene Saxby, I was the chair of the APPG for the Celtic Sea. So lovely to hear it all mentioned again here today. I just wondered what the panel thought was the solution to actually make the vision for the Celtic Sea become a reality, as we have again gone through a leasing round without a contract for difference being awarded. And whilst there's much enthusiasm for it, there isn't actually a project that's currently viable to go ahead. The one that's due to land in my former constituency is currently unlikely to ever get through planning due to the way it's being managed by some of these rogue operators, and the projects are so small in the Celtic Sea. In future, are we ever going to be able to compete with the ones that have just landed in Scotland?
Great. And then there was another hand there on the other side, Finn. The gentleman in the white shirt.
Thank you, Marcus Shepherd from Leicester. In an area of high interest rates, where what we're buying is not molecules but kit, how do we balance the need for pace on delivery against the risks of high cost of capital?
Great. And then take this gentleman at the front here.
Graham Hutton, I'm chair of Newcastle Underlyme Association. Why don't we take North Sea gas, strip out the carbon and put hydrogen through the current network? And where are we with Rolls-Royce small nuclear reactors? Surely that has to be part of the mix. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for those questions. I think that's all we'll have time for. So we're going to go to all the panellists now to pick up those points and also say any kind of concluding remarks as well. Start with Sam. I'm sure you'll pick up the Celtic Sea point from Selene in particular.
Yeah, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Selene, as well, for the work that you did in advocating for the Celtic Sea in Parliament. You're right. There's a disconnect between the scale of the projects that are available there at the moment and actual delivery of these projects. There's one test and demonstration project just off of my constituency, which is a joint venture with Simply Blue Energy and Total Energies, but that is very small in comparison to the actual gigawattage which is available out in the Celtic Sea. One of the problems was consenting, and the Crown Estate and the involvement of the Crown Estate and how they look to recoup funds for leasing of the seabed, and that's a real constraint there. There are some big projects really looking at it, and now we're moving towards more global companies looking at this part of the world. Shell have invested heavily in the local college in Pembrokeshire for a specific skills transition hub specifically looking at the availability of a future workforce to deliver on this. And to come back to the gentleman's point on the argument of net zero, one element that wasn't discussed on why we should advocate for this is the opportunities in jobs and prosperity that these delivers. These are jobs coming back into areas where unfortunately jobs have historically been leaving due to deindustrialisation. So that's an opportunity that shouldn't be underestimated. On Marcus's point around this, I think business confidence is really important. And if you've got planning authorities and planning structures which don't deliver confidence to business, and it's been evident from my time on the local authority and in opposition in Cardiff Bay that the wheels of government turn so much slower than the private sector wish them to. That business confidence will really help release some of the finance that's available and the capital to invest in this. And on Graham's point, in South Wales, the South Wales Industrial Cluster, they are looking at something called the High Line, the hydrogen line, using the gas network that's already there to put hydrogen through. The problem was that Welsh Government were looking at jumping straight to green hydrogen rather than blue hydrogen. And blue hydrogen is obviously using fossil fuels to create hydrogen. That didn't give business confidence because the amount of energy you'll need, green energy, to produce the hydrogen is so vast that they needed that subtle transition through blue hydrogen. Hard work and lobbying has finally allowed the Welsh Government to acknowledge that blue hydrogen is necessary, and so Highline, Wales and West Utilities looking at Highline and the delivery of hydrogen, and I think that's a key opportunity. Tata Steelworks is closing its blast furnace 4 today. That's the end of primary steel making in the United Kingdom. They will be looking at an electric arc furnace going forward, but the Germans are investing heavily in hydrogen for steel making. So there's an opportunity with the Highline there as well of developing it. That's another area which has been deindustrialised, opportunity of bringing jobs back. So that's the argument around net zero that I see, is not calling it net zero, but prosperity and green prosperity and the jobs coming back to communities that have lost jobs. Sorry, Sam, I rattled through those.
No, that was very good to go through them all. I'm going to go to Charles next and then brief final points from Keith and Martin.
So on the earlier question, I did the energy brief for 7 years. Every winter you get a crisis in somewhere in the energy sector, and it always affects the gas sector. So we saw the previous Russia-Ukraine dispute. When they stopped gas coming through Ukraine, that caused a spike in UK gas prices, even though we're the furthest place in Europe removed from that. We saw the Iranians threatening to blockade the Straits of Hormuz, and that's where the gas from Qatar comes through. We saw the Langeled pipeline from Norway freezing up because it was just too cold, and that's our most important gas import route. We've seen the Houthis threatening to damage ships coming through the Suez Canal. We've seen it physically blocked. And every single winter, we would see pressures on our energy system because of over-reliance on gas. And if we want to deliver security to people, then we have to find a transition which enables us to have a more balanced energy policy. I think we will still have gas in that process, but it needs to be a cleaner system, as Keith was saying earlier on. I also want to pick up on the point which Richard was saying about the supply chain resilience. And this doesn't just relate to solar, it's a much bigger issue. We saw what happened 2 years ago when Europe was over-reliant on a single source of gas coming from Russia. When circumstances changed and Germany and Italy, which thought this could never go wrong, had powered Germany's industrial revolution, and then had to fundamentally change their energy policy in a matter of weeks. We can see where the next supply chain crisis is coming from. And it's not just on solar panels. It's that all of the processed lithium comes from China, or 95% of it does, for other processed parts for the EV supply chain. We've got to have a clearer strategy for the UK and for Europe for how we deliver much greater resilience, because otherwise we're building up a problem which is going to happen and going to affect us all. And finally, on the point here about the SMRs, SMRs are moving forward. That I think they can be delivering something by the early 2030s. Rolls-Royce would be a national champion, and it does give us a chance to get back into that game. We're not going to be building big reactors, I think. Sizewell probably will get built, but I think that will be the end of the big reactors. And then after that, then we should be looking at the role for SMRs, and what's called AMRs, as well alongside it, so using perhaps thorium instead. But we need to look at where the UK can have a huge success story. Emulate what's happened in offshore wind, where we have led the world. We've been the area where they've brought down the costs. We are seen as the preeminent country in offshore wind. Where can we do that? We can do it with SMRs, I think. We can do it with carbon capture. I think we could do it with tidal, but that's about it. There are others which, like hydrogen, could be important, but where we can't be a global leader. And part of an industrial strategy to go with an energy security strategy would look at those aspects as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Charles. Given we're over time, a very brief final 30 seconds from Keith.
All right, just two quick ones then on hydrogen through the gas network. One of the biggest challenges around that is the vast majority of our gas network you can't put hydrogen through it. It's not suitable for hydrogen. So you would literally be ripping up about 80% of the gas network to replace it with pipes that were suitable for hydrogen. And that's one of its biggest challenges. And therefore, when you look at the cost of that, also the cost of producing the hydrogen versus using electricity for heating, the electricity option looks far more sensible, far more realistic, and far faster to get to. On nuclear, look, there are lots of challenges around nuclear, and I think some of those are the industry's challenges, and some of them are just the fundamentals. But if we're going to do nuclear and small modular nuclear reactors, if that's to be part of the answer, then we need to be open and honest about the price. We need to be open and honest about the timeline and when it can come in and play part of the energy mix, and what does it replace. And we need to find a more suitable funding mechanism for it to manage the cost and the impact on consumers.
Thanks, Keith. And final word for Martin.
Just to address the question from the guy from Newcastle, albeit the wrong Newcastle. Yes, of course, it's easily possible to take gas and strip out the CO2 from it. In fact, within the CCUS funding round, which will hopefully happen in the near future, there are a couple of projects that do exactly that. But the problems of using hydrogen, distributing it, getting it to where it's needed are massive. But there are some really exciting projects. Project Union is but one to help to distribute hydrogen around the country, because it will be needed in a few industrial processes that have no alternative. But yes, so it can be done. Will be, hopefully, if the funding goes ahead for it.
Brilliant. So all that remains for me now is to thank our kind sponsors for making this event possible, ScottishPower, to thank you all for coming, and to particularly thank our excellent speakers. Next up in this room, we have a panel in just under half an hour's time called Born to be Wild, How Land Use Change Can Help Us to Reach Our Environmental Goals. So please stick around for that if that's of interest. If not, please come back to some of our more SEN Fringe events and sign our leadership letter as well, which the QR code for is on the panel. But thanks very much again.
Better way to